Listeners and friends who join us from India and overseas, I welcome you all to be a part of our collective, with today being its formal launch. In these times of uncertainty, we nevertheless remain united in our shared struggles and shared hope, with the virtual platform practically emerging as a rescuer. Today, we present to you the first talk hosted on our gender platform, Viraam. We are Viraam, a network of young thinkers who are interested in bringing to light hidden forms of gendered violence that continues to be accepted, normalized, and reproduced in societies and cultures across the globe. While there is much attention, and rightly so, to the manifest forms of gender violence, we in Viram shift our gaze to micro contexts of power, which enable various forms of normative violence to continue with impunity. So we are essentially interested in what makes us say, "अरे ये तो चलता है." Boys will be boys. लड़कियां हाथ से फिसल जाएंगी. Or what makes a woman run to serve him at his bidding. We are interested in what makes a Priya or a Shaurami misinterpret hurt for love and misrecognize the process of punishment and reward as her partner's normal bouts of moodiness. We are very much interested in how a little love and intermittent acts of tenderness can be adequate, good enough. We are interested in everyday symbolic violence, a tricky terrain as it is something that many are unaware of, both men and women. Symbolic violence or a complicit type of violence and structural violence denotes violence that is so deeply ingrained that it is seemingly untraceable. Hence Viram, a term that denotes a pause, a halt, and a space of reflection. Viram is also an announcement, not anymore. A choice to reflect and re-examine the everyday acts that we now accept as normal, yet it is this very normal that causes shrinking of one's self-respect and consequent suffering, which many of us have experienced perhaps subtly. Let me now introduce to you all Professor Devnath Pathak, a founding faculty member of the Department of Sociology at the South Asian University, a university established by South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation in New Delhi. Professor Pathak writes about folklore, art, cinema, mediated communications, theories, and philosophy. He co-edits the journal Society and Culture in South Asia and is on the editorial board of journal Human Values. His recent publications in defense of the ordinary, everyday awakenings, living and dying meanings in Maithili folklore, and many others are not only of academic excellence, but splendid works of art about things which are ordinary, but in their very ordinariness hide deep social truths. In today's talk, Professor Pathak presents his nomadic ruminations on ordinary violence and what he refers to as a monochromatic masculinity of an excessively toxic kind. Professor Pathak is a member of our advisory board. His lectures shall be a part of a series that shall follow on Viram's YouTube channel. I'm also very happy to welcome amidst us Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, a retired IAS officer of the 1985 batch, former director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, and now the primary patron of the Valley of Words International Literary Festival. I take the pleasure in welcoming our special guest, Dr. Anjan Ray, Director CSIR, Indian Institute of Petroleum, an active social thinker with his interests in media, education, heritage, and environmental conservation. My special thanks to Dr. Anjali Bhatia, who is here amidst us, my professor from the Lady Shri Ram College of Delhi University. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining me, for joining, in fact, all of us, the entire Viram collective. And of course, my special thanks to our members and representatives of Viram, who make a very eager audience today. And my gratitude to all my friends who are watching us from different locations and time zones. I now request Professor Pathak to deliver his thoughts. Sir.
Thank you, Priyadarshini. I thank your team, colleagues from various places for thinking of me to have this interaction with you. Um, what I would be doing would be mostly, as I said, uh, in that adda mode, almost telling a story with bearable, also little unbearable lightness of telling. I'll try to share a possible interjection on the issue that I have proposed for this interaction. I'll keep the talk part, the monologue part shorter so that we can have more of dialogue. But one does not really know in terms of the content that comes out eventually. Wherever you feel is going overboard, please feel free to interject. So I thought of suggesting that a man is of many kind, and so is a woman. A man inherently has a possible multiplicity of masculinity, and so has a woman a possible multiplicity of femininity. In the course of time, however, under the pale of dominant rationality and the hegemony of singularity, each of us tend to become a fixed, rigid, categorical kind, the kind that can fetch pleasure of nuisance alone, one can say. Mark my very strategically selected words. And what it means need not be spelt out as soon as it is said, because it all belongs to the domain of our experiences. Ever since we learned, and many of you are students, you must be going through some of these kind of texts that I would refer to. Ever since we learned such basics from the feminist psychoanalyst Nancy Chodorow, we began to watch for the violence of singularity, an utmost possibility of liberation in polyphony of experiences. A man could be motherly, a woman fatherly, a brown one could be virtuous, and a fair one could become evil. The division of labor could be as back-breaking and blissful with gender equity. Thus, a boy can cry and a girl can console with the wisest of the birds. Pink could become a color of manhood, and the girls may begin to fly from the Mars. And in between, everything will be happy and gay. The messy world of experience that I am referring to can prove that these are not merely feminist fantasies. They truly happen. And we see them if we are not always on a judgmental crusade. But then we are, and hence we begin to internalize the tone and temper, values and ideas, styles and languages, sociality and culture of the linear, singular, and a fictional absolute. We tend to give more value to the toxic behavior of our bosses, colleagues, relatives, friends throughout our education, our calling, our profession, and our life, because somewhere we have conceded to the power of singularity, the nuisance, to say the least. We know that we have gone through history and mythology that compel us to believe in the values of the oppressors. Those who oppressed us seem to be more valuable. In reaction or otherwise too, we begin to mimic them. The whole idea of mimetic modernity in the former colonies of British Empire revealed it bluntly. Yet we keep asking, can the subaltern speak? Well, the subaltern of all hues and nature have been speaking, but those deafened by the cacophony of singularity never cared to hear out. proverb from Africa suggests that when a brutal might passed away, the weak and subjugated turned up to pay the last tribute, and while taking a bow, each quietly farted. Many of us who believed in and tried to allow the polychromatic masculinity and femininity do precisely that. We fart as elegantly as possible. I will get into more of such farting business, very unsavory farting business, a while later. Before that, let me lay out my premise, which enables my key proposition in this interaction today. Unlike a basic dictum that feminism is humanism, many of us have been made to think that feminism is an outlandish thinking and practice of some handful female academics and female students. Unfortunately, such a misnomer has been perpetuated in society as well as in academic precincts alike. If allowed, one can see that feminism is a fundamental perspective of humankind without which one could be what an ancient Sanskrit poet, Bhartihari, had prophesied in Niti Shatkam. And what did he say? Sahitya Sangeet Kala Vihina Sakshat Pashu Puch Vishanahina. And then he goes on, which can be roughly translated to be translated as human without literary, cultural, and artistic sensibilities are same as non-humans, that is, beasts. Instantly, we may think that feminism is fairly late in arrival than the Sanskrit poetry. If one thinks like a Nuvo Pandit of our time, such as Sheldon Pollock, one would try to not see any relation between the Sanskrit poetry and feminism. Yes, there are differences, for Bhartihari is not doing exactly what the feminist scholars were. Yet, we are aware that a fine craft of feminism is never averse to finding new alliances. The idea of care, love, and alliances are what makes feminism humane and relentlessly relevant. This is strategic to use a Sanskrit verse from ancient time to suggest that feminism provides us with that fine cultural sensibility which would help us be more human than a beast. And why? How? If you note a broad spectrum of feminist discourse ranging from the reflections on women's movements across the globe to feminist standpoint perspectives on science, art, and epistemology, you would notice one starkly palpable proposition, and that is to fathom the subjective experiences of those who suffer. There is absolutely no qualms about truth and lie, objectivity and subjectivity, science and art, in the way the positivist social scientists would be obsessed. There is an art of subjective experience at the core of feminist discourse, and hence there is a perpetual ways forward. So much so that it eventually turns out to be straight and happily gay at once. There is no permanent settlement, no room without windows and ventilators for unilinear perspectives in this whole discourse. One begins to celebrate polyphony and polychromatic truth, no matter how loudly the positivist, behaviorist, and realist mindsets shout from the rooftop. And what would they shout out? It's partial truth, it's half-baked, it's subjective, it's too much immersed, it's too personal, it's too attached, so on and so forth. Let the intellectual wolves howl. The feminism moves a wonderful topsy-turvy path like an Alice in the Wonderland, taking note of everything that the profound propagators of linearity, singularity, speech, poetry or politics, feeling or cognizance, intellect or emotions, public or personal, all seamlessly join in the artistic sensibility of feminism. Hence, feminism and Bharti Hari ought to be read together, in spite of our intellectual disagreement with either about certain respective quarters. This is the broader framework in which lies the key proposition of my talk. It is that monochromatic ideas, thought, and practices, institutions, and enactments induce violence. Violence that is at times concretely symbolic and on several occasions symbolically concrete. Trust me, there is no distinction of symbolic and non symbolic when it comes to violence, when it comes to experience of violence. These prefixes are only according to the relativism of experience. Violence is pure and simple violence, and any usages of prefix is merely a reflection of very transient relativism. To see and show the violence of unilinearity, singularity, and chauvinism of monochromatic imagination, we must unravel our everyday life, our immediate domains of experience, our very private spheres. It is like an anthropologist's field view rather than book view. But then the wretched sociologists, and many of us are sociologists, so we may feel uncomfortable. Many of the sociologists of South Asia would not let you understand the deeper nuances of the phrase that is field view. They imagine a field in the way rules of methods allow them, in the way some senior peers in the departments and universities would ask them to do. A field view, if you follow both Bharti Hari and feminism, is a view from within and without at once. It is a view of things very personal, no matter how discomforting it could be for the research advisors or heads of the department or deans or principals of the colleges or the academics who have metamorphosed into Franz Kafka's grotesque administrators. They may all feel very uncomfortable with this idea of field view, which a follower of Bharti Hari or feminism would like to employ. Anyone with the sensibility to follow the experiences would give no hoots to the power to be or to the established sacred formulations in the canons of any kind. Before I turn to the idea of violence once again, towards sharpening my key proposition, I am reminded of the feminist scholar and poet Bell Hooks, who died recently. But we know a thinker of her kind never disappears in spite of the death. It was musical to my ears when some of my students began to talk about bell hooks, and it only reaffirmed my faith in students' ability to break boundaries. Many of you would know bell hooks, who insisted on spelling her name in lowercase since she wished that her ideas, perspectives, and arguments shall be taller than her name, and thus sought to formulate for us a new form of feminism. It was not a feminism that can be simply taught, learnt in the classroom to write papers. There are a good number of cunning academics who do that day in and day out. They exude toxic singularity in hiding, while in front of us they tend to maintain masks, thick masks, layered masks of progressivism. Many of us have suffered such hidden toxicity at our respective places of work. Such toxic characters won't let you do what Bell Hooks asked us for. She formulated for us a feminism to live with and love, to breathe in and breach the boundaries, to be with and seek a beyond. It was a much needed and logically progressive feminism of our time that recognized differences and inequalities among women as a way of creating a new, more inclusive movement. Many of these things about Bell Hooks' works you must be familiar with. I would like to mention her first book was a collection of poems, which was titled And There We Wept, which was published in 1978. It was the first time she used the pen name Bell Hooks in homage to her maternal great grandmother, Belle Blair Hooks. Much later, in books like We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, she turned a deep glance at the worldview which resulted from centuries of oppression and exclusion of black men. She was examining masculinity in this book. My favorite works of Hooks is Teaching to Transgress. Being a teacher, I find this almost as a manifesto of what a pedagogue should be doing in the classroom. Teaching to transgress, education as the practice of freedom. Straight after reading Jiddu Krishnamurti, Paulo Freire, you feel that here comes a feminist manifesto along that line too. The book gives a comprehensive picture of the American education system that had been constructed to quell dissent and shape young people into productive workers. Hooks appealed to teachers to push against the grain by showing students how to use knowledge to resist. She did just that in her own classes, instructing her students to see critical thinking and reading as liberating acts. Many of these things that Hooks talks about in this book, Teaching to Transgress, is going to be relevant for centuries probably, for all over across the globe, and particularly in South Asia, where we have forgotten the art of teaching and the possibilities teaching can generate in the classroom, outside the classroom. What is of a curious significance in addition to all this is that she, Bell Hooks, described herself as a Buddhist Christian and spoke often of her friendship with the Buddhist monk who I follow very closely, Thich Nhat Hanh. No wonder Bell Hooks insisted that love was the only way to overcome what she called the imperialist white supremacy capitalist patriarchy. This emphasis on love of Hooks might take some of you back to an educationist like Paulo Freire, who, in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, spoke of love as a method for overcoming any kind of oppression. How to really implement the methodology of love, how to really implement a methodology of care and ethics of care, which is so central to feminism. And because of that centrality, one begins to feel the necessity of talking about feminism as humanism rather than as a cornerstone or as a specialized branch of knowledge, as something which is available to only female colleagues. Bell Hooks helped us arrive at two important realizations. One, that our violence-ridden everyday life is due to the singularity of manhood/womanhood, singularity of rationality and values, singularity of perspective and practice, all of these heavily determined by patriarchy and capitalism at once. If this is one kind of realization, the other kind of realization, the second realization we come up with is we must work toward a way out of this logjam. We must find many of the ways forward: love, empathy, care, ethics. Thus,